Hi, this is Terms of Engagement. I'm Archon Fung, a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and the director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation.
And I'm Stephen Richer. I'm the former elected Maricopa County recorder, and I'm now a fellow at the Ash Center.
So we're pre-recording this show today, but one of us, probably I will be monitoring comments when we go live and hopefully be able to respond in the comments chat. But we're recording on Monday, the day before we're airing. And so if you'd like to join the conversation, please type in the comments or send them to info@ash.harvard.edu.
And of course, we'll also be recording this, obviously, and it's available on YouTube and all major streaming platforms. And we appreciate whether you watch live or whether you watch it on recording. And as always, Archon and I are speaking on behalf of ourselves and only ourselves, not the Ash Center, not the Harvard Kennedy School, and certainly not Harvard University.
Absolutely. And just in the news today, of course, everybody's probably been following the, I don't know, I guess it's not really shocking because it's happened so many times, but terrible assassination attempt or the shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Stephen, what did you think of that?
I read the manifesto and it sent chills down my spine a little bit. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the jury receives that, how the court receives that, rather, in terms of his lucidity, his sanity to be able to proceed in what, obviously will be a very intense charges against him. So yeah, just sad. We can't have anything nice in this country, it seems.
No. And there was a Time story about how many of the people in the ballroom themselves had already, kind of had run-ins with political violence, including Stephen Scalise
was there.
Yeah.
And Steve Scalise was there. Yeah.
Right. So it's terrible. And I'm sure that in subsequent episodes, we'll be talking about political violence. On a happier note, I was reading about the the London Marathon. I didn't see it, but not one, but the first two finishers broke the 2 hour barrier. So yeah. The winner finished at 1:59:30 and the person right behind him 1:59:40. Unbelievable.
It always feels good as a runner myself to know that somebody maintained a pace that I couldn't even run for 1 mile. That person maintained it for 26.2 miles. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's amazing. And I think we're always redrawing the line of surely a human can't get faster than this. And I don't know if it's just improved technology, improved shoes, and improved training, but I guess records are made to be broken.
It's unbelievable. I can't run any distance for twice the pace that they ran for 26 miles. All right, Stephen, what are we talking about?
A 40-yard dash.
Yeah, right. Maybe. All right, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so we're not talking about things that are as recent, but still recent in the grand scheme of things, which is, of course, the Hungarian election, because on April 12th, Hungarian voters went to the polls in record numbers. Turnout reached roughly 78%, the highest in that country since the fall of communism. And they delivered results that, at least to me, somebody who doesn't study Hungary very much, were a bit surprising, because it was a stunning rebuke to leader Viktor Orbán, who had governed Hungary for 16 years. Péter Magyar, apologies if I got that wrong, 44-year-old former Fidesz insider turned opposition leader, led his TISA party to 2/3 supermajority. And that was important because that has constitutional implications when they got the 2/3 majority. And so really, I think it can be classified as something of a blowout win against Orbán for the opposition, 2/3 of the seats for the opposition party now. And importantly, Orbán immediately conceded, said the day was a sad day, but said it was a rebuke to that the people had spoken, a rebuke to his government. And so he will now be out of power for the first time in 16 years. And here to make sense of that all and tell us all the names I just mispronounced is going to be our guest, who Archon is going to introduce now.
Our guest, we couldn't have a better guest to talk about this subject. Our guest is Professor Kim-Lane Scheppele. She is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. She spent decades studying constitutional systems under stress, and she's done deep field work in Hungary, first going there in 1989 or shortly there, right after the fall of communism. And then if people want something on their reading list, you should check out her 2022 essay in the Journal of Democracy called How Viktor Orbán Wins. It's become essential reading for anyone trying to understand how autocrats consolidate power. And in this discussion, we'll be talking about how that didn't work and why. I believe she has a forthcoming book, Destroying Democracy by Law, which will be with Harvard University Press. Kim, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and really lovely to talk about the subject. By the way, I also have a piece now called How Viktor Orbán Loses, which is on the website of the Journal of Democracy. So that's the follow-up to the article you mentioned.
Oh, well, I wasn't aware of that. We'll have to check it out, and hopefully everybody watching will check it out. Not right now, but after our episode is done.
I read the 2022 one because Archon sent that over in advance, and I do want to get to that. But first, I want to address a grievous omission from your introduction by Archon, which is that you are a graduate of both your MA and your PhD of the University of Chicago, which is 3 of the last 4. And as a 2-degree Chicago holder myself, I want to recognize that.
Thank you. The University of Chicago made me who I am, which is to say combative and fierce and able to handle anything.
Cantankerous, a bit odd, maybe not that socially adept.
Exactly, all that stuff. Going to a university that tore down the football stadium to build a library was my idea of a great place to go.
Well, I apologize for my sin of omission.
So in that 2022 article, you talk about how the polls prior to that election suggested that Orbán was going to struggle to hold on to power, but that for a number of reasons that turned out to not be the case, and it wound up being a resounding victory for Orbán. And you talked about the challenges of replacing somebody like Orbán through an electoral system. So fast forward to 2026, were you surprised that somebody like Orbán could be ousted through what is sort of just a normal voting process?
Yeah, well, the Hungarian elections were completely rigged after 2010. They were problematic even before 2010 because the law that was in place from the immediate first election after the end of communism was a very disproportionate law. They were worried that there'd be tons of little parties. They wound up developing an electoral system that put its thumb on the scale of the plurality winner. It turns out the Hungarian election system quickly devolved into 6 regular parties. By the mid-2000s, it had gone down to sort of 2.5 parties. So when Viktor Orbán won under the system he inherited in 2010, he got 53% of the votes and 67% of the seats in the parliament. That was what it looked like before he got there. But then he rigged the system. And he rigged the system using some traditional methods and using some methods he borrowed from other places. So, for example, one of the first laws that he got through his parliament, and I should mention actually that the constitution they inherited and had modified from the communist constitution allows the constitution to be amended by a single 2/3 vote of the unicameral parliament, right? So when you've got this disproportionate election law and that easy amendment rule, it was sort of an accident waiting to happen that you would get somebody with a constitutional majority that wanted to take Hungary on a, shall we say, an unconstitutional constitutional course, and that's what happened. Okay, so what they did was to pass their first constitutional amendment, cut the size of the parliament in half. Everybody voted for it because it was a parliament of almost 500 members, small country. And so, again, very popular. What it gave Orbán the opportunity to do was to gerrymander the entire country. So that by 2014, when his popularity had dropped, his domestic popularity had dropped below 45%, he got 68% of the seats, okay? And that was a combination of a gerrymander and a bunch of really technical rules that you could read about more in that article, okay? So the system was just imbalanced. And then by 2018, the opposition figured out It had to unify in order to beat the system. They unified, they did not beat the system because there were so many rules that resulted in, like, even if you had majority support in the population, you couldn't necessarily win an Orbán system. Ditto in 2022. Okay, so 2026 comes along, and Péter Magyar, it's Magyar, like hodgepodge Magyar. Magyar, exactly. That GY is actually a letter in the Hungarian alphabet, and it's pronounced like a DG in English. Okay, so this is your Hungarian lesson.
Thank you.
It's a totally phonetic language, and it's gorgeous. So, you know, if you want to spend a huge amount of time learning a language that only allows you to talk to 15 million people in the world, I highly recommend Hungarian. So anyway, so Péter Magyar comes along, and, you know, he's way ahead in the polls. He's been way ahead in the polls for more than a year. And so what everybody was saying, I mean, people who don't know the Hungarian election system were saying he's going to win. What I was saying was, I don't know if he can win, right? It depends on how those votes percolate through this highly rigged system. And so I was saying up until like a month before that even with a 10-point lead in the polls, that was stable in every single pollster that was a real pollster. Orbán has some fake pollsters that make stuff up, okay? But if you looked at the real pollsters, no way he could lose unless you realized how things went through the system. And then about maybe 3 weeks ahead of the election, he hit what really is in the Hungarian system a tipping point, right? Because how did Orbán get 2/3 with 40%, 45% of the vote? It was because of how those votes were distributed. And what you could see in the polls that were more detailed running up to the election was that Péter Magyar had managed to duplicate the voting distribution pattern that meant that if he could just win 50% of the vote, say, he could flip the thing, and sure enough, he gets 53% of the vote, but he wins 71% of the seats because he actually walked into Orbán's system, reproduced how it got rigged in one direction, and flipped it in the other direction, right?
Wow.
And just to say, I mean, again, there's lots of in the weeds detail, but the crucial point was that Orbán had weighted the system so that almost every rural vote counted for 2 or 3 times an urban vote. So you had to win the countryside. And, you know, in every place, I'm sure both of you will know this, in every place where right-wing populists have come to power, it's because they win the rural, less educated vote. And the cities will always, the cosmopolitan vote will always go for the challenger, right? So you needed to win over the base that supported that election system. And so Péter Magyar started 2 years ahead of the election, and he campaigned in virtually every village and small settlement in person across the countryside, okay? Because again, he's not only facing Orbán's rigged voting system, but he's facing Orbán's rigged media system, right? Orbán's message is across all the TV, all the radio, all the papers with any substantial circulation, and most of the internet, okay?
So he had to play for Orbán's core constituency because the maps were so rigged to favor that core constituency. That's a tough political uphill fight.
Exactly. I mean, you know, it's just when you realize what he had to do to flip it, it's even more dramatic than, you know, just being ahead in the polls, right? Yeah. It's being ahead in the polls and distributing the votes to win. And he's a lawyer. He's a very good lawyer, actually. Orbán's and his whole team are lawyers. That's why I hate to say it, but fun studying them because they come up with all kinds of innovative legal things, you know, and just figuring out how they do what they do is like a giant Rubik's Cube, which of course Hungarians also invented. And so, you know, just looking at their system is kind of fascinating from just an intellectual point of view. So Péter Magyar was able to figure out how the system was rigged and aim his campaign at basically reproducing the way that Orbán was able to win these supermajorities without supermajority votes. Yeah.
And game theory, right? Wasn't von Neumann Hungarian?
Oh, they're all Hungarian, right? I mean, there were so many. Right. So János von Neumann, as he's called in Hungarian, absolutely. And then you go to, you know, all the Hungarians that were involved in Los Alamos. And I mean, you know, Hungarians are amazing. They win every mathematical prize and every swimming competition. So don't get, and actually the week that Nobel Prizes are awarded is like holiday week in Hungary. Everybody is like glued to the radio to figure out how many Hungarians are going to get prizes this year.
But a
And
lot of them came to the United States to
most
win
of
those
them are
prizes.
not still in Hungary.
Yeah.
I mean, the most recent, Katalin Karikó, right, who was the
mRNA.
researcher who invented the mRNA vaccines. And of course, Laszlo Krasznahorkai got the literary prize last year. I mean, so, I remember reading somebody who was doing publicity for the city of Budapest asked me to look over their flyer to attract tourists. And they said, home of 3 million people and 41 Nobel Prize winners. And I said, most people don't pick where they're going to go on vacation by how many Nobel Prize winners there are. But
I would.
yeah, well, I would too. That's why I moved there, right? The whole country, and is really good at this stuff, and they're also really good at that kind of lawyering. I mean, both for good and for devious stuff, right? So it's the same kind of like immense intellectual abilities now, gone to, shall we say, not such great purposes. But
I do want
on
to
the way back.
I do want to put one footnote because I'm an election administrator and I'm honor bound. When you say rigging, you mean changing the laws such that they advantage the incumbent party, oftentimes through the manifestation of gerrymandering, which is, of course, a lawful strategy in the United States, a lawful strategy maybe in Hungary too, but still can skew advantage as opposed to stuffing ballot boxes.
Yeah,
exactly. So election day is always fine. The election administrators are straight shooters. Like, you don't have any trouble with election day administration. It's all in rigging the rules. So let me give you another example. So Viktor Orbán gave, and when I say him, it's like him and his 2/3 parliament, right? Gave citizenship to Hungarians in all the neighboring states. And they've been channeling welfare payments to them. If you're from Ukraine or you're from Serbia, you get an EU passport with that. So very attractive thing. And also if you're in, these poorer regions where the Hungarian populations live on the edges of Hungary, they were getting Hungarian social welfare benefits. So he gave them citizenship, also gave them the right to vote. That vote, which is now, so the Hungarian electorate is about 6 million voters, 5.5 in a normal election. We were close to 6 for this. So, small population. The number of voters in the near abroad is 500,000. Okay. Now those votes are completely unmonitored, right? No, they send them mail ballots. There are bundlers who collect these things in villages and walk them across the border and deliver them. Nobody has any way of checking whether those are real voters, whether they cast real ballots, whether the bundlers opened up the ballots throughout all the ones for everybody else. Those ballots have come in the last 4 elections, 90%, 95% for Orbán. Okay, wow. So, and that's 500,000 votes you can throw into the system. Those votes are counted a week after the election, right? So you can wait and see how many votes you need and then throw them in. It's a little complicated how they get figured in, but they do get figured in. In the meantime, Orbán's policies have driven a lot of Hungarians out of the country. So there are lots of Hungarians that were fired from public service jobs, that were affected by the loss of academic freedom, that were journalists who needed to find work abroad after all the news organizations were taken over.
Who would be the normal opposition?
They're the opposition. Now, because they once lived in Hungary and they have an address in Hungary, they can vote in constituencies as well as for party lists. Okay. The over-the-border ones can only vote on party lists, okay? So what they've set up is a system in which if you have an address in Hungary, you can't vote by mail. They have no way, they say, of mailing you a ballot. Instead, you have to register and go to an embassy or consulate in the country where you're living and cast your ballot there. Okay. And what they do with those ballots is you show up and suddenly they change the ID you need to vote. But you've gone from Edinburgh down to London to vote, and then you can't get back up and back to find your passport in addition to your voting card, for example. Or they've actually sent out wrong information about where to go to vote. Or you show up and when you sign the name that's supposed to match the register has one less diacritic than your name normally, like an accent mark, than your name normally has, and then they don't allow you to vote. So Hungarians in that category have discovered all kinds of obstacles to voting, right? And they're the ones who are going to vote against Orbán.
Fascinating. So
I can go on about
this. There's all kinds of parallels to U.S. political fights, like what vote by mail is or isn't in order to advantage one side or other. And then what you're describing with Hungarians living outside of Hungary, I think it's what Trump has accused the Democrats of, is a version of the replacement theory. It's like you're replacing voters with other voters.
Yeah.
And then a third parallel is partisan efforts at gerrymandering can easily, not easily, but sometimes turn into a dummy mander if you slice too thinly, and what you drew the map to get a majority in the legislature and disproportionate majority can end up flipping and get you a disproportionate minority of seats in the legislature, which is what happened to Orbán. And some people are saying may happen to the Republicans in this midterm cycle if there's a blue wave amidst all of this midterm gerrymandering that's going on.
Exactly.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, were you surprised, or was it ever in the cards for Orbán to reject the results of the election as Maduro did in Venezuela and as Donald Trump did in 2020?
Yeah. So all day long and in the run up to the election, the Orbán forces were saying, we know there's going to be fraud. We suspect there's going to be fraud. They did this whole pre-buttal campaign saying there's going to be fraud. And the way the election law set up, again, remember, they've designed the system to keep themselves in power. All the election complaints go immediately to the Constitutional Court, separate court that handles only constitutional issues and election complaints. The Constitutional Court is entirely packed with their own people. Out of the 15 judges, there's only one that isn't entirely in their camp, okay?
Wow.
So that if they could generate the fraud complaints, it would go to a packed court, right? And all under time deadlines and whatever. And so, and in fact, the external monitors complained about the complaint system because it really does go to these packed institutions. Also on the Electoral Commission, they used to have a rule that every party that ran candidates could get a vote on the Election Commission. Well, they changed that and they threw off all the other party members and they only had their own people. So the whole system, if you could cast doubt on the results, the back end system that would process any close elections, recounts, doubts were all in their hands. So what happened, the reason why Orbán conceded was you look at an election map and I don't know if there's a way to put up a slide, a share screen, but I can show you that what the election map shows you is that just to give you a sense, there are 106 election districts. In the last election, where the opposition was more successful than it had ever been, Orbán won only 85. In the past, he'd always won more than 9. So successful gerrymandering is, right? This election, Péter Magyar won 96. Okay, so he flipped all of these. And when you look at the margins, the Fidesz camp only won 10 districts. Wait a second. No, Péter Magyar won 895. The Fidesz won 11 districts. Their margins were razor thin in those districts, which is to say there's no place in the country where there was less than 45% of the population for Péter Magyar.
Huh.
And in the districts that Magyar won, there were often 20, 30-point splits, right? Which is to say Fidesz lost really big.
I see. So maybe it was too big to rig.
It was too big to rig. That was exactly it. There was nowhere, he could see that there was nowhere to go.
So do you think on the counterfactual that if it had been a closer election, but still Péter Magyar victory, that Orbán would have seriously contested and denied?
Oh yeah, they were setting it up to contest it. Okay. But here's the other thing. In Hungary, because of this constitutional majority, like with 2/3 vote, you can put yourself above the law, essentially. Slightly dangerous, but better now than before. What the thing is, you can win a simple majority or you can win a 2/3 majority. In both cases, you win the election. Okay. The next stage after the gerrymandering is that Orbán has put in place a brand new constitution and almost 46 what are called cardinal laws. Cardinal laws are laws that also require 2/3 majorities to change them. So they're almost as entrenched as the Constitution itself. And these cardinal laws regulate every detail of the system that holds Orbán in place. And the people who manage the government under those laws are all his appointees. So if Péter Magyar had gotten a simple majority, he would have been completely unable to govern because every detail is in these laws that require a 2/3 majority to change, right?
I see.
So, so the question was not just winning, it was winning 2/3. And I was saying up until a week and a half before the election, that 2/3, I mean, like a simple majority was hard given how rigged the system was. 2/3 majority was impossible, right? And then this poll came out about a week ahead. There's a fabulous Hungarian polling organization called Median. They almost got it exactly on the nose right. And they did a poll of 3,000 people 2 weeks before the election, so they could kind of get down to the district level. And what they showed you was how widespread that the vote distribution, right, was across the whole country and wasn't just piled up in the cities. And once I saw that, it was like, he can get 2/3.
Okay. Tell me why this is stupid then, because this was a thought that I had. I was surprised that Orbán lost, based on what I'd read, 1 or 2 articles, and I just assumed he'd been in there for a long time.
For a really long time. Yeah.
And then I was very surprised when he conceded quickly and in pretty decent language. And so that made me think like, oh, maybe he wasn't as bad as I had once thought. And then a lot of commentators in the United States said, this is the guy you've been calling a dictator for a long time. Well, dictators don't usually concede.
Right.
So tell me why that's off.
Yes, great question.
Yeah. So there's old-fashioned dictators who just, like Maduro they just cancel the election and they just take over. Okay. But there are all of these new autocrats that pretend to be Democrats, right? They don't want to be seen as not democratic. They put forward this, democratic facade. I mean, Viktor Orbán's been saying for years, I have my 2/3 majority. I've been elected by 2/3. Never mind that he nor Magyar ever got 2/3 of the public to vote for them, right? That's just an artifact of the electoral system. But, he was claiming a democratic mandate. And what was happening in the streets of Budapest, I mean, was that there were tons of election monitors, there were tons of foreign journalists, and there were hundreds of thousands of people in the street dancing, okay? It's really hard under those circumstances to claim the election's rigged and deny the results there, okay? But Orbán is a fighter. He is not going to give up. And so what we need, and now that all the journalists are gone, now that the monitors are gone, we're starting to see Act 2 here about how he will either stay in power or return to power quickly, okay? So the first thing is that, yes, the system is rigged, okay? So the whole system is rigged, okay? We've gone through the voting scheme. Now we're going to talk about governance, right? So if you've been following what's been happening in Poland, we're going to find the same problem here, right? So you get autocratic aspirants who come into power, they rig parts of the system, then the election throws them out, okay? Because people get fed up with dictatorships. Okay, so then what happens is that Péter Magyar has a 2/3 majority. He can pass any law, he can amend the Constitution, but everything that he does has to be countersigned by the President of the Republic, who is a Fidesz guy. Which is to say, the same that happened in Poland, right, where you've got the aspirational autocrat controlling the choke point. That means that no law can go into effect because the president will veto it. Okay, so then they say, we're not going to pass formal laws that the president has to sign. We're going to reinterpret the laws or do things by executive decree or other workarounds so you don't need the president's signature. And all of those cases have a quick way to get to the Constitutional Court, which is also packed. Okay, so in other words, he's won the crown, but he can't leave the castle. Like all of these choke points are there. And what I said, actually, I mean, before the election, and I might have gotten it wrong, but so what you saw was Orbán went into hiding for a few days. So here's the thing about Orbán. He thinks and he reads, okay? And whenever he's had a crisis in his career, he disappears for a little bit because he has to reset, right? He has to figure out, how do I operate? And he came out with what is just the most clever argument I can imagine. That's why these guys are so much fun to study. He didn't come out personally, but his spokesfolks came out and said, you know what the Hungarian system needs are checks and balances, because checks and balances are essential to constitutional democracy. And therefore, we need a president who is with Fidesz. We need to maintain control over these offices. And the fact that Péter Magyar is going to come into power and sweep all these people away is a sign that he's a dictator.
Wow.
Can you imagine? So they started a petition online for Hungarians to vote for checks and balances. And, they're trying to drum up all the support for keeping the presidency in the hands of Fidesz. Now, this guy, Tamás Solyok, who's the president of the republic, has at first was saying, I'm going to talk to Péter Magyar, let's negotiate, whatever. Then this petition took away his degrees of freedom to do that. And so now the question is, he's got 3 more years left on his term. The Magyar government has 4 years. Okay, so one thing they could do is just wait out the 3 years and pass everything at the end. But the other thing they can do is that there's a lame duck parliament where Orbán still controls 2/3 of the seats. It takes 2/3 vote to elect a president. Between now and May 9th, when the new government comes in, Mr. Solyok could resign, allowing Orbán's parliament to elect a replacement that would restart the clock for 5 years.
Okay. So the president is elected by the members of the parliament.
That's right.
And I stumbled over this a little bit in the introduction because I didn't know actually if the new government and the new election had taken effect yet. And you're saying, much like in the United States, where we have our election in November, but the new members aren't seated until January and the new president isn't sworn in until January 20th. The winners of the elections, the parliament members and Magyar himself, have not been sworn into their new offices.
Orbán is still prime minister. The 2/3 Orbán parliament is still there. Okay.
Yeah.
So they can come back into session and do all this stuff.
I see. So in comparative politics right now, I think the political scientists are fond of all these geometric analogies, right? There's democratic backsliding, which means democracy is going backwards. And now there's this idea of a U-turn where it's backsliding for a while, but then there's the forces of democracy win. So maybe you're turning a corner. Right. But it sounds like, Kim, you don't quite think that this is a U-turn. It's something else. It's
So
U-turns, trench warfare or something.
Yeah, exactly. So U-turns are very complicated, and it depends on how much the aspirational autocrats dug themselves into the constitutional system, right? So take, Trump 1 and Bolsonaro. I wrote a piece on this with my colleague David Posen, in which we talked about presidential underreach as opposed to presidential overreach. Like the way those two guys governed was that they sort of dropped government on the floor to see if it would break, okay? But they didn't do a lot of massive changing of the system. They didn't fill positions, they didn't spend the money, they just didn't, they took government offline, so to speak, or dropped government on the floor. Okay, so it was very easy, or relatively easy. The one exception, of course, in Trump 1 was packing the courts. Okay, but everything else, Trump was just chaotic, Bolsonaro was just chaotic. When you could get a new government in, they could start to do a U-turn. Okay, but let me tell you about Brazil. Okay, so Brazil, they have an independent federal police that investigated the coup attempt that Bolsonaro was in the process of carrying out. The independent prosecutor confirmed these charges, went to the independent Supreme Court, they convicted him. So you're saying U-turn, not so fast, okay? Because in the Brazilian system, Bolsonaro, like all of these, right-wing autocrats, have their support in the rural areas. The Senate in Brazil, the upper chamber, overweights the rural areas, like the Senate in the U.S., right? Yeah. They copied us, unfortunately, right? So everyone believes in the election that happens later this year, Bolsonaro's people, because again, with these new autocrats that are displaced, they still have a lot of popular support. It's like Trump, Orbán got 37% of the vote. He's got supporters. So, and Bolsonaro has a lot of supporters. That election was very close. People expect the Senate to change hands. And under the Brazilian Constitution, the Senate can impeach Supreme Court judges with a simple majority vote. Okay. I've been working with the Brazilian Supreme Court. I was down there last summer to observe the trial and so on. All the judges believe they're going to be impeached at the end of this year. And then the new judges can reverse the conviction and pardon Bolsonaro. So it's not over, right? Yeah. These things cycle, especially if they've captured other political institutions. So this is massively
not so fast with the U-turns.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and ditto in Poland, right? They got this election. But there's a president that's of the other party. There's a constitutional court that's rigged. They have not been able to pass the legislation that they promised in their campaign. They've been getting less popular because they look ineffective because of the choke points. And, the idea that they can win the next election is really in doubt, right? So choke points are really crucial. Yeah.
Do you think that there is a path forward for the new government, which hasn't been sworn in yet, to reestablish a constitutional liberal democracy? And if so, what sort of indicators will we start to see?
Yeah, so because Peter Magyar has this overwhelming victory, I mean, he theoretically has the possibility to change anything. So one of the possibilities is that they go outside the legislative process to have a constituent assembly, which bypasses a presidential veto. Okay? The other way, and this is the way I've been advocating, and bear with me because it's slightly technical, but I'll try to make it really comprehensible. What Hungary has going for it that Brazil doesn't, for example, Hungary is a member of the EU. Hungary isn't, this dictatorship that Orbán set up is in violation of EU law on multiple points. And EU law has what's called direct effect, meaning when something is legal, when they pass a law in the EU, it becomes Hungarian law immediately. So one thing we've been, and Peter Magyar knows this, so one of the things he's proposed, day one, that Hungary join something called the European Public Prosecutor's Office. Now, this is an optional office that the EU sets up at your service to investigate the misspending of EU funds. Orbán and his circle has gotten wealthy primarily by putting EU funds into private pockets. Okay, so the prosecution service in Hungary is captured, takes a 2/3 vote with presidential signature to replace and restructure that office. So deadlocked, captured. They have a spare prosecution service they can use. Okay, now the problem is the EU is insisting that legislation be passed in Hungary to join. But the question is, can they work out something other than a legislative, but that's a workaround. So you have a spare prosecution service. You also have the European Court of Justice, which just made this incredibly revolutionary decision a week ago. Conflict of interest. I've been working on that case for some time. And I was cited by the preliminary opinion that led to the judgment. So just to let you know that I have a serious interest in that matter.
Noted. Thank you.
Just to disclose conflicts, because after we gave up on the Hungarian institutions, a lot of us pivoted to EU law to have it come back and bite Hungary, right? So right now, the EU is withholding a lot of money from Hungary, conditional on them restoring judicial independence, fighting corruption, restoring academic freedom. There's a whole list. Okay, and Peter Magyar promised he would get the money back. So now the question is whether the EU law demand can override Hungarian law, because EU law takes precedence over Hungarian law where they conflict, right? So the question is, can you leverage the EU law demands into legislation in Hungary that does not require presidential signature because it must be directly applied by the courts? Okay.
I see.
So I taught at Harvard as you know, in the spring of 2017 at the law school, teaching EU law, right? So that's now one of my fields. And you can use EU law to give Hungary what it's missing domestically.
Some democratic levers. Yeah.
Right. And in fact, a group of us just had a
levers.
meeting last week with EU law experts and folks from Poland and folks from Hungary about how to do that. So it's underway.
Yeah.
Just to disclose my own conflict of interest here.
Yeah, good. That's fascinating. We just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to pivot to implications for American politics. So in the reporting, in the political reporting, Orbán's illiberal democracy has been a little bit of a beacon and a model for some on the American right, and on the MAGA right in particular. There's reporting that maybe Orbán's government funded CPAC. So what do you see as the attraction of illiberal democracy for the American colleagues? That's kind of one thing that I wanted to get your views on. And then the second, is Orbán's electoral loss meaningful in the American context for those who see his illiberal democracy as something of a model?
Yeah. Well, Hungary has been, for the American right, what Sweden used to be for the American left. Right?
That's a great analogy.
Right. It's proof of concept. You can do social state. You can be, remember how all those
Volvos more than
right, exactly.
Though.
Like, remember back when people used to think that, democratic socialism was possible in America and like Sweden was the model. So Hungary's become the MAGA model, right? Like you can have this illiberal system which locks down power, which, operates with public acquiescence. You can create a dictatorship that masquerades as a democracy, and you can do, and what, anti-woke stuff. I mean, Orban had a whole series of policies, which, by the way, never ran that deep in Hungary. That was for external consumption, but you can do that kind of thing at national level, okay? And so what Orban did was to create this thing, we're doing Hungarian lessons again, called the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, okay, which is this thing that's a cross between a university, a think tank, a propaganda center, and an international network, okay? They donated 1% of Hungarian GDP to create this thing. So it's huge. It's huge. And what it does is it trains the cadres that go into Orban's system. Okay, it develops the kind of, they have fake think tanks, fake pollsters, a whole series of, they have something called the Fundamental Rights Center, which was created mostly to rebut everything I was writing about Hungary, and then it broadened when more people started rebutting what was going on in Hungary. They have a whole bunch of things, and they have this English language think tank called the Danube Institute. Okay, now the Danube Institute offers fellowships. It's beautiful. Budapest is, by the way, if you've never been there, it's a lovely city. And so even under a dictatorship, you can vacation there and think you're in paradise if you don't speak the language and understand what they're saying. But anyway, so Danube was this English language think tank. Danube has, a lot of the Trump people have cycled through the Danube Institute getting training in how the Orban people did things. Okay, just to give you one example, Chris Rufo spent a lot of time looking at how Orban crashed academic freedom in Hungary, has come back and done higher ed policy in the US. Okay, so that's just one example. Another example of somebody who actually didn't pass through Danube but passed through the Orban orbit is the counterterrorism advisor in the White House, is Sebastian Gorka, who's Hungarian, who worked in the Hungarian Defense Ministry, started a political party in Hungary that was in competition with Orban back in the 2000 and the aughts. He and Orban made some agreement, at which point all of Gorka's people went into Orban's party, and Gorka came to the US, married an American, got citizenship, and went immediately into Trump's orbit. And now he's the counterterrorism advisor in the White House, right? So lots of these people have gone back and forth. And so one of the questions is, so does that apparatus stay put? And the answer is yes. Because imagining Orban always knows he might win an election, might lose an election. So he idiot-proofs his system. So they gave that money from the state budget to the MCC, as it's called, as an endowment. So it's now out of the hands of ordinary budgeting, and therefore it can remain as this huge network, and it supports all these far-right parties in Europe and so on. They were behind the campaign that engineered the European elections, in which far-right parties joined now, and they're the third largest party in the European Parliament. So it's a huge network, and it will remain because its funding is stable, right? So now there's some pieces of it that Péter Magyar can easily claw back, but there's some pieces of it that he can't. So some of that network is going to remain in place to continue to inspire and train MAGA folks.
Yeah, interesting.
Do you read any tea leaves for the United States from it? Sort of to the last half of our conversation.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I mean, one is that this network is really powerful. It's international. And I forget if I mentioned the Danube Institute was one of the players in writing Project 2025. And a lot of the opening salvo of Trump was exactly the opening salvo of Orban. So we can talk later about all the connections between Project 2025, the Orban takeover, and the Trump takeover, because it was really hardwired into that plan. That's the first lesson. It works, right? You just do blitz. You use the national budget as a weapon. You mass fire civil servants. You put everybody in fear by singling out arbitrary targets. And then everybody keeps their heads down and says, like, I have nothing to do with this. I'll leave a private life. Okay. So as what's happened here is exactly what happened in Hungary. Okay. That's part one, the lesson for the right. But there's also a lesson for the left, which is that everybody asked me, is Péter Magyar left or right? And the answer is he comes out of Orban's party. He's a center-right guy on policy like immigration or family protection or like all these kind of gay rights, all that stuff. He's sort of center-right. This was not a left-right election. He campaigned by saying, look at the corruption of the Orban regime. And even though the press was, massively muzzled, there were some investigative journalists who turned up concrete evidence of the corruption of Orban's family, Orban's friends, and Orban. And that was also assisted by what we believe are leaks from the European security services, whose taps of Russian phones disclosed that Orbán and Putin were having friendly conversations in which Orbán was saying, "You're the lion, we're the mouse, how can we be helpful?" And conversations between the foreign minister of Hungary and Russia, where the Hungarian foreign minister was telling the Russians everything the EU was going to do on Ukraine that happened in secret meetings. Okay, so the corruption and the Russian stuff came out. It meant that this was like, how can you tolerate this government that violates our values? And Péter Magyar's campaign was so clever. This is lesson for the left, or lesson, it shouldn't just be the left, right? The opposition to autocracy in the US. That corruption has meant that you don't get the public services you deserve. In Péter Magyar's case, it was the public health system, education, transportation. But here we can look at all of the way the big, beautiful bill defunded so much of what people counted on for basic livelihoods, right? The way the federal budget has been weaponized. And, at Harvard, of course, you feel this a lot. Chicago and Princeton, I think, have felt it somewhat less. But, universities are in the crosshairs. Yeah. Law firms, media organizations. So you go after how the corruption has resulted in less money for you. And then you say, and how are those connected? It's because you lost your voice in picking your leaders. And therefore, I can be your voice to undo that, to claw back the money and use it for you. Okay, that was his campaign. That's not a left campaign or a right campaign. It's a democracy campaign.
Right.
Right? And that was actually what persuaded so many people that this corruption they could see was affecting them personally, and they could overcome it if they came together. And one last thing, Magyar's campaign said, we should not be a country that lives in fear. He would go to all these rallies in villages across the country with zero security. He would say, if I'm not afraid, you don't have to be afraid. And all those people who kept their heads down because the arbitrary sword of Damocles was just hitting whomever, right, realized they can't do it to all of us if we all show up. And so Péter Magyar's rallies were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger as this fear message meant everybody realizes we don't have to be afraid if we're all in this together. Okay, now that's a campaign that's transportable, right? That I can imagine would work here. So what we might find, is MAGA on the right, Magyar on the left. We might actually have now a recipe for cracking the budding autocracy here in the US.
Right. So interesting. Well, we're about out of time, but I think it's left us all with an enormous amount to think about. Is like not quite a U-turn, the resilience of autocratic movements and leaders, even in defeat, and then these transnational links and some of the lessons, and maybe the most effective anti-autocratic champion might come from the center right, as it did in Hungary, which is very, very interesting. Yeah, Stephen.
No, a lot to unpack. I think it's interesting. We have a colleague at the Ash Center this year who's Italian, and he would have told us that he thought corruption was not the ticket to electoral success, just because he witnessed corruption that was fairly open in Italy, but wasn't replaced. But this would certainly seem to be a data point very much in favor. I think if we had 30 more minutes, I would want to talk about, did Vice President Harris run on democracy, and was that rebuffed in the American electorate? So we could have that conversation as well. And then just generally speaking, I think it's I guess I'm consistently, when we have these conversations, we had someone from Iran, we had someone from Venezuela, and now you're representing, though not in Hungary, but representing Hungary. I just want somebody to come on and say, you know what? Everything's great now. That one election, that was the whole U-turn, it's I guess it's messier and uglier than that.
Democracy is hard work. Right? I mean, look, elections are necessary, but they're not sufficient. Right. And people can't just vote and go home. Right. Because when you have to dig out the roots of an autocratic system where the roots are buried very deep, it's going to take public effort and consistent public, messaging. If I can just say one last thing about corruption, though, because remember, this campaign in Hungary was done without the support of any of what we would call the mainstream media. It's all been captured. 80% of the media outlets are in Orbán's hands, particularly in the rural areas, right? what was crucial to this was memification. And the way that corruption got memified was that there was an anti-corruption campaigner that hired a drone to fly above this like Versailles-like complex that Orban's father had built. Orban said, "It's my father, it's not me." It's like, how did your father get wealthy? Because he's your dad. Never mind. This drone flew over the estate and discovered a herd of zebras. Okay.
In the middle of Hungary.
In the middle of Hungary, right? They're not native, like just to let people know if you don't know the geography, they don't come from there, right? And so the zebras became the symbol of corruption.
Wow.
So people would, it was just like memification, right? So people would show up in zebra costumes at these rallies, little zebra pins, little zebras were like everywhere. People would, anyway, so that was one thing. And then the memification on the deprivation of social services side was that Péter Magyar would take these camera crews into hospitals and film just the decrepit state of them. I mean, frankly, they've been decrepit since I lived there in the 90s, right? So nothing new, but still, they should have fixed them up. And the meme became, and you know, in hospitals, they don't even have toilet paper. So somehow Péter Magyar got somebody to donate a flatbed truck full of toilet paper to a children's hospital. So he shows up in front of the children's hospital, donating the toilet paper to the children's hospital, okay? So between the zebra and the toilet paper, you had these like condensed symbols of like what was wrong. Like they have zebras, you don't have toilet paper. You know, I mean, it's a little bit, I mean, you could do that in any system, but it was really crucial. The messaging was brilliant.
Yeah. Everybody knows what's wrong, but these things really crystallize it in
exactly.
a powerful way.
So you need powerful messaging. You need instant response. This was a case, by the way, we always talk about how social media destroys democracy. This was a case where social media saved it, right? The opposition had a YouTube channel. Péter Magyar was only on the YouTube channel. He never appeared on regular television.
Wow.
And they did everything through Facebook. You know, and Facebook in the EU now, they've banned political advertisements, which is what Orban used to do, is just flood Facebook with political ads. What happened was the opposition came up with, they're not ads, right? They're just they're explanations, and they're just memification, lots of zebras, lots of, you know, all this stuff. And so it was a campaign that was only possible because of social media. So we shouldn't immediately assume social media is the anti-democratic force.
Especially in context when the other media is completely closed off.
Exactly.
Okay.
So some of the lessons.
Tim, you've got to run.
I got to run.
You told you had to run.
I could talk to you guys forever, but
no,
check
this is
back when we
terrific.
get a little farther in to see, can you do a U-turn if all the institutions are really dug in? And can transnational institutions help, to mix a metaphor, pull the country out of the ditch? Right?
And we'll have you back when we have a few more months experience, and hopefully we'll be on the upswing in Hungary. And
we left it on a nice note. Social media playing a positive role for democracy for once. So thanks again. We'll be back next Tuesday, 12:15 p.m. If you have any questions, comments, please write in. Thank you, as always, to our production team, and thank you to all of our listeners. As always, we'll see you live next week.
Absolutely. And huge thanks to Kim.
Thank you. Great conversation. Let's keep it up.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.